me today on this episode of Town Talk, Director of Natural Resources, Nina Coleman. We're going to talk a little bit about beaches and how we maintain them throughout the summer. Nina, thanks for coming on Town Talk. Lots of information out there swirling about our citizenry, talking about beaches, rack lines, birds, MISA, all sorts of acronyms. What's going on? Tell us a little bit about how we maintain beaches at this time of the year and why this year might be just a little bit different.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. There is a lot of misinformation, so I'm excited to talk to you today about this topic, which is beach raking in our rack line. In the past, we did weekly beach raking at many of our marquee beaches. And last summer, we actually stopped raking about mid-season because the state Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program had reached out to us and said that we needed some special permitting in order to continue that activity on specific beaches in town. And those specific beaches in town are the ones that have piping plovers and least terns associated with them.
All right, and we'll just, for folks who don't know which those beaches are, just rattle through. I know we start at Calamus and we come up the south side.
Right, so you've got Calamus and Douses. Craigville and Covels also has endangered species nearby, so they're listed as priority habitat. So I just want to back up and say these laws are not just for the animals themselves, but also for the habitat, and that's a distinction that's really important to understand. So Covels, Craigville, and then Forts is not priority habitat at this time, but there's a new activity there that's going to put it into priority habitat. And then, of course, Sandy Neck Beach. Right. We all know Sandy Neck. We all know that there's plovers all over the place. Right. But Sandy Neck is in its own category and has quite a bit of permitting associated with the off-road beach. So that one we're not even going to talk about today.
Okay. So south side, you're mentioning some different types of beach activity habitat. Let's talk a little bit about rack lines. There's two. There's not one, but there's two. So let's start with rack lines, why they're important to the habitat, and which ones really are affected by beach raking.
Yeah, so rack is a natural occurring thing in our environment. It's the seaweed and other sort of critters floating around in our waters, and the tide deposits that on our beach. You know, we have sort of the active rack line. So if you're thinking of sort of an average Cape Cod day without a big wind, that tide comes in, it goes out, it leaves that sort of rack line right near the water. Yep. And that rack line we've never raked. That's an active rack line that's really important for a number of things. And so that has always been off the table for raking. There's often a high rack line, which would occur during a storm. So on our south side beaches, if the wind's out of the south or west or east, depending on which beach you're talking about, you could have a rack line deposited higher up the beach. And that's what the beach raking is for, that plus litter and sort of just to, you know, go through make it look groomed, essentially. Sure. So, you know, nature wants one thing and often humans want another, right? So people want groomed landscape, just like around your house, you know, people want that perfect lawn, and that's not necessarily what's good for the environment. And so we're trying to strike a balance, or the state's trying to strike a balance on nature versus, you know, what we would want in a recreational area. So even once we get these permits, I need to make it clear that the permits are going to limit how much rack we can take off our beach. But that high rack line is something that if we had a really big storm and we had a big pile of seaweed come in, that's the kind of rack line that I think would be really undesirable. And that's the rack line that even this season, there is an opportunity to get that up if we do have that type of variables come together.
Sure. So just to make sure that people understand that the rack line closest to the water, you know, right there at the wave line, has never ever been raked. It's always there. It's a super great place for little plovers to find some food and maybe a tern here and there and all sorts of shells. And then that upper rack line, again, may build because of a bad storm, but on most cases isn't very large to begin with, right? Did I get that correct? I want to make sure that I understand it so our viewers understand as well.
I think basically that's the answer.
Right.
Of course, it's nature, so and each beach is positioned differently. So
yeah.
some of our beaches have, just an upper rack line, and some have more of a deposit. But again, that is correct. The lower rack line is the active rack line. That's where you're going to see all your shorebirds poking around, and so that material. Brings in little invertebrates, which is something that all these shorebirds want, including our piping plovers. Least terns fish, just so you know. So not our leasties, but our plovers, our sanderlings, all of those goodies. And the rack also has some beach building characteristics. So if you go on Coastal Zone Management website, it talks a lot about how a really high rack line up against the dunes actually promotes dune building. And promotes vegetation because it's a good source of nutrient. So it's a naturally occurring phenomenon.
Right.
But again, to stress, if we had that big blow out of the north, I'm thinking of Sandy Neck, out of the south, and we really were concerned about the health, people's health, and and odor and so forth, I'm committed to trying to get that up.
Right. Right, and that would probably be a whole lot of folks from Recreation and DPW and Natural Resources trying to manage this rack line manually rather than trying to take out a machine with that, right?
Yes,
okay.
For the most part, yes.
Okay, excellent. Anything else that you want folks to really understand about this process? We talk a lot about how much our beaches are world-renowned. Out there this past summer, we're going to see different things on our beaches. So what do you want people to really understand, and maybe some tips, because not everything on the rack line is from the ocean. It's from us.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what we can do to help keep our beaches clean and safe for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly, as you mentioned, unfortunately, there's so much trash and plastics that are in our oceans, and that's far more dangerous, for the environment. So picking up anything that you can see of that nature. When you go to the beach, just be really careful that you aren't littering, that you're not feeding the wildlife inadvertently because you have French fries and seagulls are there, and that's bringing them in, and that's unbalancing the system. So all of those things are really important. Reminding folks dogs are not allowed on beaches this time of year, but year-round. Let's pick up after those dogs, and be respectful of each other. And so, and enjoy. There's great books out there about beach combing, like the contrived system, the overgroomed system is not as interesting, right? So there's great books out there. Get your kids a dip net, and get involved. Turn that seaweed line over at the lower rack line, and all these things are popping up and bouncing around. That's cool,
right?
And that's Cape Cod, and that's interesting. And so it's really just changing. It's like changing your mindset. And maybe even your expectations a little about what is beautiful and what is Cape Cod. And again, I want to keep stressing, we're not going to let it become some overly seaweeded area, but it's going to be looking different than perhaps you've had in past years. So those are all super fun things. Get a bird book. Learn about what those birds are. A lot of people see sanderlings in there in flocks, and they think they're plovers. I cannot tell you how many people are like, oh, there are plovers everywhere. Well, no, those are sanderlings. They look really different. So wouldn't it be cool to know what a sanderling is, and then all of a sudden there is a plover, and you see, because plovers they really just hang out in their pairs, so you're not going to get a flock of plovers. And so to be like, oh my gosh, that bird looks different. That's a plover. And our beaches are piping plover habitat. Whether you like it or not, they're here, they're protected, their habitat is protected. It's protected under the Endangered Species Act, both federally and state.
Right.
So that's a lot of protections. And what the town is trying to do is stay in compliant with that so that we don't get in trouble, right? We want to get all this permitting done, make sure that we claim everything that we do at all our beaches, have an understanding about how we're going to manage these species, and then that gives us the reassurance that when we do something like raking, that we're doing it within the guidelines as prescribed by the Endangered Species Act. So we're being proactive here.
Right, and this is in progress. It's not that we're going to wait for another 2 years. We are actively seeking understanding and permitting at this time.
We are actively seeking it. It's a new-ish, meets the requirement. A lot of communities have been raking historically, and recently the state's like, this is an activity that we want to have these understandings, written understandings with these communities about how you're going to do this and still protect the habitat and the plovers. So we're kind of on the front edge of this new requirement, but we are actively looking at other communities and private beach clubs that have done this, reviewing what that permit looks like, and then what kind of conditions are attached to that permit so we understand this new process. And then we have a bunch of beaches, right? So we need to pick away at it. It is a bit of a heavy lift.
Right.
But we really, we're not waiting. We're definitely not waiting. We're getting going right on this project.
Okay, last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If I have questions from the citizens or the residents, can they call you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They can call the Natural Resource Department. Myself or one of my colleagues can certainly answer questions. I also would, say if there's a particular beach that would be really good to know about. Oh, I'm concerned here. This is a specific place that looks different today, and is there something we can do? And what do my eyes say when I look at it versus a citizen's? Like, maybe I can explain that that's all sort of natural and not a problem, and oh, thanks for pointing out that is starting to get to be too much seaweed. Let's see where we can go with that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nina.
Oh my gosh, thank you.